I'm Bob Short. This is Reflection on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the Duckworth Library at Young Harris College and the Russell Library at the University of Georgia. We're here at Manuel's Tavern, an Atlanta gathering place for political and other misguided souls. Our guest tonight is Tom Houck, well-known civil rights activist, advisor to numerous political figures, radio talk show host, and a man about the town in Atlanta. Welcome, Tom.
Well, it's quite an honor to be with you, Bob Short, and a shout out here to Kathy Cox up there at Young Harris.
Good. From Boston to Jacksonville to Atlanta. Tell us about your early life and how and why you came here.
Well, I guess you could say on August 21st, 1947, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in a public hospital, an instigator provocateur was born. And that man was me. They called me Buster in the hospital because I was crying and yelling and screaming from the moment I came out of my mother's womb. And I went on to I lived in Somerville, which is actually a poorer section of Boston, and just outside of Cambridge for the first 6 years of my life. Very working class Irish and Italian neighborhood. I come from Irish-German parentage, and my father was a machinist when he could find work. Most of the time he was unemployed. My mother was a waitress at Howard Johnson Restaurant, and several Howard Johnson restaurants. They got a little money together. They finally moved out to the suburbs to Framingham outside of Boston, where I started to develop some of my own social consciousness. My second grade teacher was a black woman. And in those days, this was back in 1953, segregation in public schools in most places in the country, not so much in the Northeast, although it was de facto, was mandated by law. It wasn't until the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954 that changed that. So I was very fortunate as a young fellow to have an African-American teacher who, Miss Thompson, sort of became my guidance, if you will, to where I would go down the road. And television was just becoming a major thing back in those days. Not really a major thing. If you had a television, the whole neighborhood would be down the street watching it at your house. And we had a TV. So I moved towards gravitation towards the news. Started to watch the news. And I started to see what was happening in terms of the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. And I asked my second grade teacher about this, and she told me that in many sections of the country, colored and Negro students couldn't go to school with white students. Well, I just couldn't understand that. I couldn't understand why that was. Here I am as 8 or 9 years old. So then at that moment, I would say, if you would say is the defining moment why I became involved in the civil rights movement, and why in many ways I came to Atlanta, Georgia, which was in later in my life, was because of what happened in 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education decision, and television. All of those kind of things mixed together. And when I was 12 years old, I was in Cambridge visiting a friend, and his uncle was a Unitarian minister and said he was going over to Woolworths to picket a Woolworths to give support, and this is 1960, for the students in Greensboro, North Carolina, who were getting arrested for sitting in at lunch counters. And so that was my first actual time carrying a sign, a picket sign, when I was 12 years old outside a Woolworth store in Central Square, Cambridge, Massachusetts.
When did you meet Dr. Martin Luther King?
Well, I met Dr. King actually. I mean, I'm sure he wouldn't remember this, but I actually met him in Selma in 1965. I had been going to high school and named for the founder of the Ku Klux Klan, Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest, and I was in Jacksonville, Florida, living with an aunt. I caused quite a stir at that high school, but you asked me how I met Dr. King, so what I did was me and a couple of other students from Nathan Bedford Forrest, which was an all-white high school, still segregated in Jacksonville, went to Selma the week after Bloody Sunday, when our good friend, now Congressman John Lewis, and Hosea Williams led the march across and were brutally attacked with horses and dogs and billy clubs and a great deal of violence by the Alabama State Troopers. That was in March of 1965. I actually went into a meeting of SCLC staff, which was right down the street from the church in Selma, where everybody was congregating for the big march at Selma Montgomery March, and I actually met Dr. King that day. It wasn't until about a year later that I actually became part of SCLC staff, and actually my boss was Hosea Williams. He was the field director for SCLC, and I went to work for SCLC. And so it was through Hosea that I really met Dr. King.
Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about SCLC.
Well, SCLC was started out of the Montgomery bus boycott in 1956, and 55 and 56. And it was started by Ralph David Abernathy, Reverend Dr. Joseph Lowry, and by Dr. Martin Luther King, along with a number of other people in the Montgomery Improvement Association, which was the organization in Montgomery that basically organized the demonstrations in the successful year-long boycott of the Montgomery buses, led by the arrest of Rosa Parks. So what happened was, there was a number of churches across the South. The one thing that the authorities and government couldn't do in the South was to stop black churches. Black churches were the places where folks could go, where folks could sing, where folks could pray, where folks could organize, where folks could get out there and do the job of trying to right the wrongs of the past couple of hundred years. So there were preachers all across the South. They started this organization based in Montgomery, which Dr. King, by the way, had gone to Montgomery, funny enough, because he didn't want to be in his father's shadows in Atlanta. So in Montgomery, found himself what they would call there a high yellow church, which would be a church that was sort of made up of male men and male women, mostly male men in those days, black male men and male women, rail porters, the higher echelon economic groups, some doctors and teachers, and he went to Dexter Avenue over there. And that's when he wasn't interested in getting in the movement, by the way. Dr. King just wanted basically to get on his own and preach on his own and not be under his father's shadows in Atlanta. So when he went to Montgomery, he had no idea that he was going to be leading a bus boycott within a year. And neither did the people in his church. Because, as I said, this was a middle-income church, a stone's throw from the cradle of the Confederacy over there, the Capitol on Dexter Avenue in Montgomery, Alabama. But what Dr. King did was, when he became that leader, when he became that voice, we're talking about a man of 25 years old. He was 25 years old when he led that Montgomery bus boycott and went on the national scene. Well, in 1957, the year after the Montgomery bus boycott ended and was successful, the organization was created, and it was thought by most of the preachers that rather than having Montgomery as the headquarters, that the logical place would be Atlanta. So 2 years after Dr. King began pastoring at Dexter, he moved to Atlanta and set up headquarters here on Auburn Avenue, right down the street from his father's church, and became associate pastor. He was never pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church. Daddy King would let people know that as well. He was always the associate pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church.
He was born on Auburn Avenue.
He was born on Auburn Avenue. He came back and put the headquarters of SCLC at Auburn Avenue. Was the associate pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church on Auburn Avenue. And his funeral was at Ebenezer Baptist Church, and 150,000 people on April 9th, 1968 marched down Auburn Avenue.
Mm-hmm. Well, tell us a little bit about your association with him when you were his chauffeur.
Well, let me tell you about that, how that happened. I was actually over working under Jose's, I was working in the field department of SCLC, and we were over in Grenada, Mississippi. And we were doing a peaceful demonstration, September of 1966. And it was a support march of desegregating a high school there. And Dr. King and SCLC, which didn't have a lot of high presence in Mississippi. That was pretty much SNCC and other civil rights organizations. SCLC strains for Georgia, Alabama, and other parts of the South. But Mississippi was very strong with SNCC, but we went over there. So there were about 20 SCLC staff people are sitting around, and Dr. King's talking about the fact that he had a lot of mail that he had to answer in Atlanta. He had a lot of mail that, that he was not getting answered, and he needed some volunteers. So I raised my hand in the staff meeting, and I said, Dr. King, I can help answer mail. He said, Tom, you haven't even finished high school. And I said, well, I didn't finish high school because I got kicked out of high school. When I went to Selma, they suspended me for 2 weeks. They wanted to give me my diploma, and I refused it as a badge of honor. And so Dr. King said, now what can you write? I said, well, I was a sports editor of my high school newspaper. And he said, can you really answer mail? And I said, I can. And so Dr. King looks at Bernard Lee, who was one of his assistants at that point, and Hosea wasn't in the room. Thank goodness. Had Hosea been in the room that day, I probably never would have been Dr. King's driver, because he would have refused to let me go. But Hosea, I think, had already left, so he wasn't there. So Martin said, well, you want to wait for a couple of days and ride back? Or he said, you want to take a bus? And we'll get you a bus ticket to come to Atlanta. I said, well, I'd love to take a bus because I've never been through Memphis, and I understand the bus has to go from here to Memphis to get to Atlanta. And I wanted to go see what Memphis looked like. So I got back to Atlanta, and I got back there on a Sunday morning, probably around 10 o'clock, and I went down to the SCLC headquarters, which was right down the street from Ebenezer, and there was no one there. And in those days, there were no cell phones. There were no iPhones. You had to go to the phone across the street at the VFW, put a nickel in, and make a phone call, which I did to the Freedom House where I was going to stay. And they said someone was going to come get you. Well, it went on for an hour and a half. No one came to get me, and finally Dr. King had finished his sermon down the street at Ebenezer, which I should have gone down to, but I didn't. And he drives up in front of Ebenezer, and he says, Tom, he says, nobody's picked you up from the Freedom House yet. He said, no. He said, why don't you come have lunch with us? Lord have mercy. Have lunch at the King household? It was incredible. And so, as chance be, I went to have lunch at the household, and the kids were in the car with me, and Dr. King had to go to a meeting, and Coretta started talking to me about Boston and my past and all that kind of stuff. And what happened was she asked me if I had my driver's license. I said, yeah. And I said, why are you asking that question? He said, well, she's had trouble with her drivers, and she said, why don't you think about taking the kids? I said, I don't really know nothing about Atlanta, but I was probably GPS to, GTS before that happened. I knew how to get places very quickly and go on a map. So Coretta asked me if I would take the kids to school the next day. And I said, I'd be delighted to. I'll check in with Jose, see what he has to say, since he was my official boss. And she said, don't worry about it, I'll have Martin call him. And so I wound up driving the kids to school the next day, and then for a couple of weeks went back and forth driving the kids to school, helping to answer mail. And then Dr. King asked me if I would come on the road with him on times, and when he was traveling, but always in Atlanta. My job was basically to take the kids around and take Dr. King to the airport wherever he had to be when he was back in town. Mm-hmm. I'll shut this off.
Well, my wife, Diana, wanted me to ask you what you had for lunch.
Who asked that question?
My wife, Diana.
Why did she ask that question?
She was curious.
What did I have for lunch? I had a grilled cheese sandwich.
Well, then I guess that answers her next question, which was Mrs. King a good cook?
Yes. Let me bring you into the household if I can. Give you an intimate side of this, by the way. I'm still in the process of putting together my memoir, Driving Dr. King, Looking at History in My Rearview Mirror. Dr. King actually had Dr. King and Coretta King actually had 4 or 5 people on staff that worked for them. Dr. King had a meager income. He could have chosen to live in those days, the Beverly Hills of the black community in Atlanta, Collier Heights, and where his daddy lived and a number of other prominent blacks lived, but he chose to live in Vine City. So when he moved from what became the Freedom House, which unfortunately was torn down on Johnson Avenue, he moved over to the ghetto, in Vine City in Atlanta. And everybody was saying, no. Dr. King needs to have a better house. And he said he didn't need a big house. He didn't need to have all the trapments of a big house, and neither did Coretta. He had a very basic brick bungalow on Sunset Avenue in Atlanta, where Coretta lived until the year before her death, just a few years back. And so she had a staff of like 4 people. She had, when I say a staff, Mrs. Lockhart was their cook and housekeeper. But Coretta would cook more often than she would. Now, there's one thing that Coretta wouldn't cook. She wouldn't cook chitlins. And Dr. King loved chitlins. But one of his favorite and best friends was Juanita Abernathy, Ralph Abernathy's wife, who was an expert chitlin cooker. So my first smell of chitlins was at Juanita Abernathy, Ralph Abernathy's house. But yes, Coretta was a good cook.
Good. Before we get too far along, let me ask you about, and let's talk about Hosea Williams.
Well, I don't think there's anybody like him. Little David. He was a man that served his country, came back from serving his country, and was beaten down in Attapulcus, Georgia, at a water fountain. And it was from that moment on that he decided that he was never going to be beaten by anybody again in life, that he was going to be a crusader. Moved on to Savannah and got involved in the civil rights movement in Savannah. Taught at Morris Brown College for a while, was a chemist, and he was field director for SCLC. He was not necessarily a devotee to nonviolence in the sense of what nonviolence was. He was a character bigger than life, a hell of an organizer. Hosea was what Martin used to refer to as his kamikazes. Wasn't afraid of nobody, no one, nowhere. And he liked a little taste every once in a while. He was noted for his driving a car while under the influence, we'll put it nicely. But Hosea probably is underrated in a sense. There's now a statue on the other side of the Alabama River in Selma that commemorates the march with he and John Lewis. And John's a very good friend of mine. But Hosea, I think, in many ways, was underrated in terms of his leadership in the civil rights movement and what he did. He brought 400 or 500 students down here in 1966 that helped really change, in terms of voting rights and all across the South. Hosea was tenacious in his ability to organize and keep a good staff going, keep on going strong. And he was the leader. If there's such a thing in the civil rights movement in the 60s, he was the leader of the foot soldiers of the civil rights movement. He was the sergeant out there, Bob.
Mm-hmm. Well, back to Dr. King. What did you and Dr. King talk about while you were driving?
Oh, all kinds of things. Those days you didn't have telephones in the car. You didn't have cell phone. So, he was trapped. I was trapped. However way you want to look at it, in terms of talking. So we talk about it from everything from music to what was happening in the organization, and there was other people in the car. I'm a 19-year-old kid now. Remember, the 19-year-old kid driving around, at this point, the leader of the March on Washington, had already won the Nobel Peace Prize, had led major movements in Selma and also Montgomery, and had been, was seen all over the world as a man of the millennium. And here I am driving him around in one of 2 cars. He had a Pontiac Bonneville, and he had a blue Bel Air Chevrolet. And oftentimes he'd drive me. I would just have the car, and he'd just take me out to the airport. And it was the old Atlanta airport. In those days, you didn't go through a lot of security. And there was no security, actually. Just walked right into the airport. And so we would talk about music. We would talk about what was coming up. And Dr. King didn't have, by the way, but today everybody would have an entourage around them, or they'd have a security guard. They'd have, people with little earpieces in their ear. Dr. King didn't have any of that entrapment. He had me, but it was always a interesting aspect to hear him talk about politics and where politics would be. I don't think King lived that he would have followed the path of Jesse Jackson to run for president, or Andy Young and run for Congress. I think Martin would never have run for public office. But he did say, and it was interesting to hear this just recently, in a BBC interview back in the 1960s, Dr. King said that he fully expected that an African American would be elected president, if not in his lifetime, but shortly thereafter. And he said they asked him within 40 years, and he said maybe less, which was very prophetic in the sense of where he thought this would be, where this country would be today. And he would talk about the opportunities that he saw coming. But he also saw the economic hardship as being much more difficult to break down in terms of the poor in this country than the color barrier. And he said he thought that would last way beyond that century, which was the last century, and into the new and 21st century.
What was his opinion of the massive resistance to desegregation among the politicians in the South?
Well, interestingly enough, the way you put it, okay, Lyndon Johnson had said, I think, to Richard Russell that when he signed the Voting Rights Act, he said he'd lost the white vote. Democrats had lost the white folks for the next century, or half century. And Martin saw it the same way. He realized that there had to be a new breed of white politicians. There was already a number of whites across the South who had conscience and had been involved in the civil rights movement. Many of them had to leave the towns and cities they were in, like Charles Morgan Jr. had to leave Birmingham after praising Dr. King on his Birmingham jail speech, jail letter. But Dr. King, I think, saw that there would be a new breed of white leadership that would rise up in what you call the 11 southern states of the old Confederacy. And I think he saw that there would be a day when there would be more Ivan Allens. And Ivan Allen was already around in 1964 when he testified, and there would be more Charles Weltners here in Atlanta. There was a number of white politicians that stood out in terms of where, in his time, where the South was headed. And he saw more Ivan Allens and Charles Weltners coming along.
Mm-hmm. Did he have any hobbies?
Yeah, swimming. I mean, he was a great swimmer, which he had in common with Andy Young. Mm-hmm. Softball. He loved playing softball. He used to love the bug. For those who don't know what the bug is, that's the lottery. And we used to go to a little shop down on Auburn Avenue here, owned by one of the biggest lotto guys in the South, or with bug men in the South, a guy named Charles Cato, God bless his soul, who used to run a little operation on the corner of Auburn Avenue in Piedmont. Dr. King would go in there and, play the numbers.
Did he ever win?
Occasionally he'd win. But it was something that he would occasionally. He also loved to travel. Was and a reader. I mean, he'd bring 10 books with him when he was on the road. I mean, he would just go through, read. And he was also quite a historian, besides being a biblical scholar.
Mm-hmm. Well, you drove the King children to school. Were they enrolled in public schools?
Mm-hmm. When I was driving, and they were, Yolanda went to school at Spring Street Elementary School, which is now the Puppetry Arts in Atlanta. Mm-hmm. Then she went on to go to Grady High School. Interestingly enough, one of the children that would drive in the car with us, two of the children that would drive in the car that I'd pick up and drive to school with, one was Maria Saporta, who went on to become a columnist here in Atlanta and for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And another was Eric Roberts, whose sister is now the famous actress out in California, Julia Roberts. Mm-hmm. And the Robertses, their family, had a theater workshop here for kids, children's workshop, and Yolanda went to the theater workshop with Julia's parents. And I was there at the workshop when Julia's mother was pregnant with her.
Is that right? You're going to tell us your age in a minute if you aren't careful. Did the King children ever talk about racial segregation?
Not really. I mean, not in those days they didn't. Of course, since then, But Daddy King used to worry quite a bit, by the way, talking about Coretta, wanted to know how safe it was. We're talking about 1966, me driving, the white guy driving 4 black kids around Atlanta. Obviously they knew that, and went through the process of their father and mother in the movement. Coretta, by the way, was very much a part of the civil rights movement, but why they couldn't, get their shoes fit in the same, shoe store as the white kids, or why they had to go to a segregated water fountain, all those things happened. But Coretta and Martin made sure that their children had everything that the white kids had, and made sure that their household was integrated at all times, and it was.
Mm-hmm. How much was she involved in his civil rights activities?
Coretta was involved every day. Coretta was an unpaid first lady of the civil rights movement. She did a lot of freedom concerts around the country. She was a singer. She's an opera singer by training, and so she would do these freedom concerts around the country that would raise great amounts of money for SCLC, and she would be it was a tenacious fundraiser for the movement, and she didn't want to leave the kids very often. So, and by the way, Dr. King and Coretta both took the kids on what they would consider to be safe demonstrations and marches around. Of course, in those days, what was safe, but what they could be safe, and so the kids traveled with them extensively as well. Mm-hmm. And you would see photos of them, for example, when the Montgomery-Selma March reached the Capitol in Montgomery in 1965, the kids participated in that march. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's well known that Dr. King fashioned his nonviolent approach on Mahatma Gandhi and his teachings. Did he ever meet Mahatma Gandhi?
He did. He was in India. He and Coretta went to India. As a matter of fact, Congressman Lewis and Ambassador Andrew Young just came back from a trip to India last year that retraced the steps of Dr. King and Mrs. King in the late 50s. The Kings went to India and spent 3 weeks, and Martin King III went over there as well with them. But and the influences of Gandhi in the household were tremendous. Gandhi, with photos of Gandhi around, there were statues of Gandhi around, there was writings of Gandhi around, and of course a great deal of history of Gandhi's relationship to South Africa was around. And so Dr. King was a Gandhian philosopher, and bringing together Christianity with that nonviolence.
Mm-hmm. His nonviolent approach was not always supported by many civil rights activists, particularly among younger ones and Black Power activists. What do you think about that?
Dr. King knew that he couldn't sell his philosophy to everybody, or that other people would buy into nonviolence as being the only method in which social justice would take place. For example, he was great friends with Malcolm X. And Malcolm X, a lot of people would say, would be a black separatist. He was friends with Stokely Carmichael, who really echoed the cry, Black Power. He was friends across the board with people who didn't have his own philosophy. He would hope that people would choose to come under the banner of nonviolence in SCLC. But it was in Memphis, 1968, Dr. King, before you could march in Dr. King's marches or demonstrations that he led or SCLC led, you had to go to nonviolent workshops. Mm-hmm. So that would, right then and there, take out a lot of people from participating in it, because they can say, well, I'm not going to turn the other cheek. If someone hits me, I'm going to hit them back. Mm-hmm. And that's a hard thing to do, is to go in there and not have that happen. But in 1968 in Memphis, one of the few demonstrations that Dr. King actually led turned into violence in the streets, and that's what caused Dr. King to go back in there to want to put together another demonstration to prove that nonviolence could work, as we were organizing the Poor People's Campaign in Washington, which was going to be the largest nonviolent demonstration and live-in in the nation's history, to build tents in Resurrection City. But one of the worst demonstrations, I want to talk not just about the South, but one of the worst demonstrations that Dr. King ever faced in his life was an open housing demonstration in Chicago. There was a great deal of resentment and hate and hostility in 1966 when King went to Chicago. Then the late Richard J. Daley, mayor of Chicago, didn't take to heaven Martin Luther King Jr., bring his nonviolent end the slums and open housing demonstrations to his city. And it was his city. And so it caused a great deal of problems with not only I think it was one of the few battles that King actually lost was in Chicago in 1966, and probably the most violent demonstration he ever faced was going to try an open housing demonstration in Gage Park in Chicago in '66, when he actually got hit by a rock.
You were on the march to Washington, weren't you?
I wasn't on 1963. I wasn't. I was living in Cambridge, Maryland then. Still involved with the civil rights movement. I just moved to Cambridge, from Cambridge, Maryland, to Jacksonville, Florida, with my aunt. But no, I wanted to be there. I was 14, 15 years old at the time. But shortly thereafter, my legs got to moving in marches.
With Hosea.
With Hosea.
What was the extent?
I met Hosea, by the way, in St. Augustine when I was still in high school. He was in St. Augustine, 1964. And which was trying to get public accommodations integrated, and that was in 1964 when I met Hosea, and J.T. Johnson, a number of other civil rights figures that were down there, Dorothy Cotton, a number of people from SCLC. That was my first real associationship with SCLC. I was in Jacksonville, Florida, where there was really no SCLC chapter, but an NAACP chapter, and that's where I would bring all these white kids every Wednesday night to the NAACP youth meetings, and from this white high school, Lathan Bedford Forest.
How did Dr. King, I might have asked you this, how did he react to these Georgia governors and senators who used him as an issue in their political campaigns?
Well, you know, the politician in the King family was Daddy King. Daddy King was the politician in the family. Dr. King didn't really participate in politics, although in 1960, it was his jailing here in Georgia, down in Albany, that probably changed the course of election for John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And Daddy King broke with a number of other black leaders here who were supporting Richard Nixon, because in Georgia you had essentially a Democratic Party, as you well know, that was all white. Right. And the Republicans allowed black folks to participate. So most blacks in the South, and particularly in Georgia and Atlanta, who were registered to vote, were Republicans. But Daddy King split in 1960 with Williams Holmes Borders, who was another famous black preacher here in Atlanta, whose granddaughter is running for mayor of Atlanta. Borders went with Nixon. And King always used to say, Daddy King used to say, the Borders are always Republican. They're always going to be Republican. They're going to be Republican no matter what. And Daddy King went for John Kennedy. And that reverberated around the country and probably changed enough votes among black folks in other parts of the country, from Nixon to Kennedy, to change the election. But Daddy King got along with Georgia governors. You know, he'd go up there and meet with the Georgia. I mean, he realized that it was segregation and that a lot of that wasn't going to change, but getting certain things done, I think, is the way he looked at it. And I think that in the latter part of the 60s, King died in 68 now, as you well recall, things began to change rather dramatically. I think that the entire civil rights movement was in distress when Lester Maddox was elected governor. I mean, this is a man that came out and shooed people who wanted to close his restaurant down rather than serve black folks, and with an axe handle in his own Pickwick restaurant. So I think that, and in later years, I mean, when I was doing talk radio, of course, I got to know Lester a little bit better. You always call me Mr. Tom, by the way. Lester. I mean, so I got to know him a lot better over the years, and you know, I mean, I think that he regretted a lot what people saw towards him as what really took place. And of course, George Wallace, on his dying bed, apologized to the country and the world for saying segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Right. So I think that dynamic in the civil rights movement worked. Unfortunately, Bob, is that too much of what we happened in the reformation of white Democratic governors in the South is nowadays called the Republican Party of the South.
Well, you're probably right. Tell me, was Dr. King ever concerned about the FBI and the government's continual?
You know, you're glad I know what you're going to say. No. He said, as long as they're around, I'm protected. And I mean, that King used to see the FBI is, and people who say, well, you got all these tapes on him with women and all this other kind of stuff. Dr. King knew that his phones were being bugged. Dr. King knew that his mail was being checked. Dr. King knew that they were outside his house. Dr. King knew, and he actually saw that as not as a fear, because, he kept saying, well, we're just trying to do right. He kept saying that, that with them there, that will keep some of the racists and segregationists away from them. Mm-hmm. I mean, amazingly enough.
Well, Tom, I know you've been asked this question hundreds of times, but I must ask it for the sake of keeping our interview authentic.
Absolutely.
Was Dr. King the ladies' man he's been accused of being?
No more or less than you, Bob.
Then I guess the answer is no.
What's that old saying? Those who know don't say, and those who say don't know.
All right. Well, you understand I had to ask you that question. Let's talk.
Well, I had to respond that way.
You did.
Yeah.
You gave a very good response. Let's talk a little bit more about your role with the SCLC. Tell us about some of the activities that you were involved in during that period.
Well, I helped do a lot of different things for SCLC. I was in Birmingham, Alabama in 1966 when we went back to make sure that after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, a lot of places still didn't want to register black voters. And they wouldn't add additional voter registrars, they wouldn't add additional days or hours, and there were thousands of black people all across the South that wanted to register to vote. This was going to be their first time to register to vote. So what we had to do is we had to keep up the vigilance of making sure that these cities and towns would register people to vote. Well, Birmingham, which shouldn't be a surprise to many people, continued its policies of basically allowing black voters, or black potential voters, only in on 3 days of the week, 2 hours a day. This is a year after the Voting Rights Act was passed. So we went back to Birmingham in 1966. And my job was to organize and help develop demonstrations with Hosea and with a number of other people. Stoney Cooks, who worked in SCLC in those days, Andy would come over, and Dr. King came back to Birmingham, and Shuttlesworth and other people, and Reverend Gardner. And so my job was to get these high school students from Parker High School to the demonstration downtown to block the intersection at 5 o'clock. In those days in Birmingham, they didn't have expressways. They used to have free viaducts that led across to the suburbs and these other places. And I went to Parker High School, and my job was to get these kids out to march in the demonstrations, and I broke the lock that had put together this fence in the back. And the Birmingham police and the notorious police wagon saw me doing this, and here's a white guy at a black high school doing this, and my job was to get them out of there, okay? Well, in the process, they found me later in the day and arrested me and put me in jail, charging me with disturbing the peace, resisting arrest, assaulting an officer, threw the book at me. It was much more dangerous for me. I went to jail probably 18, 20 times in the civil rights movement, but it was always more dangerous for me to be put in jail for my own life, because I was a white guy. I wasn't put in jail with the brothers. I was put in jail with white folks. Those same white folks out there couldn't stand seeing white nigger lover, come into their town. And it wasn't nice. It wasn't pretty. But after Birmingham, after this instance, it was a very bad incident that occurred there. I was in jail for almost 30 hours. Hosea and I filed suit against Birmingham-Jefferson County and the law to desegregate the jails. And that lawsuit wound its way through the state courts in Alabama. Of course, they rejected the notion of desegregation of jail. Went to the federal court, and Frank Johnson's in Montgomery, who favored us, but the Alabama Attorney General tried to overturn that, went all the way to the Supreme Court. So one of the most famous cases that I was involved in was Houck and Williams v. Birmingham-Jefferson County to desegregate the jails. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, which made it happen.
And you won.
We won.
Who is your attorney?
Well, two attorneys, Howard Moore, who represented Julian Bond's brother-in-law, and Charles Morgan Jr., who was just recently passed away after a very good friend of both of ours for years.
Chuck was a great man.
He was a great man.
Tell us a little bit about Chuck.
Chuck was a man of great courage, born in Birmingham, and became a fierce advocate for civil liberties, and he was a wealthy lawyer actually when he was in Birmingham, and came from a wealthy family in Birmingham. And he spoke out loudly and very affirmatively in Birmingham after Dr. King wrote his letter, and after the demonstrations happened in Birmingham, after the kids were part of the demonstrations out there, where the kids were fire hosed and they were brutalized very badly. He came out and basically wrote his own letter to his Birmingham fellow white citizens, and they gave him a resounding get the hell out of town, ultimately winding up in Atlanta, where he became the regional director of the ACLU and heading up the ACLU Voting Rights Project in the South. Went on to represent a number of people. One of his most famous cases, I would imagine, would be Muhammad Ali. And he was successful in representing Muhammad Ali, the champ. Went on to Washington to live and died in Destin, Florida, not too long ago.
Right.
Great champion of civil liberties.
I want to ask you this question now.
And a good friend, by the way, of our old friend, Zell Miller.
Is he your old friend? Does that mean you're no longer his friend?
Old friend. I'm just putting that in quote. Miller will always be my friend. You helped introduce me to Miller. I mean, Miller goes back in civil rights history as well. Miller worked with Bob and Lester Maddox. And between 1968 and 1974, there was a dramatic 350 in Miller's political philosophy. And it was one that changed the political face of Georgia politics until Sonny Perdue was elected the first Republican. And Miller was very instrumental in making that happen by putting together a coalition in this state of black folks, women. He came up for the Equal Rights Amendment. That was a very radical thing to do back in the 1970s, and put together a coalition of black folks, low-income white folks, mountain folks, folks from down South Georgia, below the gnat line, and women. And he beat a woman, and he beat Max Cleland, who was a war hero at that point, a triple amputee coming back here running for politics for the first time. We were successful in making Miller lieutenant governor. Only time I've ever worked in government in my life was working 3 months after Miller got elected in 1975, and it convinced me that I'll never want to do it again.
Why?
Miller! Even though we were on the same page, it was a tornado that took place here. It hit the governor's mansion. And I was down at the Capitol. It was about 7 o'clock in the morning. And I commandeered the state helicopter. Do you remember this? And I was giving radio reports to WSB and WGST and WP. In those days, there were a lot more news stations around town. And Miller heard me on the radio and said, "What the hell are you doing up there?" "Well, how'd you get there? How'd you get there?" And he took me he didn't speak to me for 3 days. Didn't fire me, but didn't speak to me for 3 days.
Well, my question was, if Dr. King had not become the voice of the civil rights movement,
I wouldn't be here.
Who would have?
All right. That'd be a hard question to answer. I doubt you and I would be sitting here talking today had Dr. King not become that leader of the civil rights movement, because what that did, that made Atlanta the center of the civil rights movement, and what changed so much so because of King. I mean, King was obviously not the only person, okay? There were a lot of people that were out there, but he was the leader of a massive movement from 1955 until his assassination in 1968. Atlanta became ground zero for that movement. Had It had not been for Dr. King, SNCC probably would never have been founded. SNCC actually was founded under SCLC's auspices. But had Dr. King not been from Atlanta and had not led the movement from Atlanta, based in Atlanta, Andy Young wouldn't be here. Tom Houck wouldn't be here. Joe Lowry wouldn't be here. We go on. There'd be no Hosea feed the hungry because Hosea Williams wouldn't be here. I mean, John Lewis wouldn't be here. Julian Bond probably would be here because he was an academic. But he probably wouldn't be the president of the NAACP, the chairman of the NAACP today. So much happened because King was where he was, and that movement he led. And it changed the whole equation of the city of Atlanta, to bringing Maynard Jackson back from selling encyclopedias to running for mayor, to the succession of him and Andy Young and the young Bill Campbells of the world from Raleigh that wanted to come to Atlanta, to Shirley Franklin that left Washington, D.C. to come to Atlanta. Atlanta became a magnet for young black thoughts and minds.
Let's go to 1973, the year that the city charter was changed. There was an election, and it was the first time that black Atlanta had an opportunity to elect its public officials. Do you remember that year?
I sure do. As a matter of fact, I had just come back from registering 18-year-olds to vote, and I decided that I was heady enough after several million dollars and heading up a staff of about 100 people around the country to register 18-year-olds to vote, only to vote in minor numbers and seeing Richard Nixon pull off a 49-state sweep over George McGovern. I had just come back to Atlanta, and I ran for the Board of Aldermen in pretty much an all-white district here in Atlanta. But I remember then when Maynard Jackson decided that he was going to challenge Sam Massell. Sam Massell himself in 1969, after Ivan Allen, was very split because a lot of white people that supported supported Ivan Allen, were more of the blue blood North Side type and were not Sam Massell. Sam Massell was Atlanta's first Jewish mayor. What happened was Massell came into power and probably made a few missteps along the way, including electing the police chief, John Inman, and it created quite a controversy in town and pushed Maynard Jackson into the race. Maynard Jackson had been vice mayor under Sam Massell. It was a very heady time. Maynard Holbrook Jackson was a very strong figure. When he would walk in a room, people would turn around and take a look at him, not just because he was 325 pounds and 6'3", but because he had that charisma. And he put together the first major organization. Now, Leroy Johnson had been elected prior to that, and Q.V. Williamson was on the Board of Aldermen here, the old Board of Aldermen. But this was the first time that you were going to see substantive change in black political power flex its muscle. And it wasn't a very good campaign. It was a very hard-fought campaign. In the end, Sam Massell was running ads, which I think he regrets to this day, about Atlanta being a city too young to die, and having tumbleweed go down Peachtree Street in his ads.
But the city council was elected that year also. And there were, as I recall, except for Q.V. Williamson, the first black members in many, many years.
There were several black members elected that year, 3 or 4, one including a friend of ours, James George Bond, was elected. Julian Bond's brother was elected, and there was 3 others that elected. Jim Maddox, who's retiring now after all those years, was elected to city council that year. And there was a new, if you will, a changing face of City Hall, not just because there were black folks now holding city in seats, but because there was a feeling that for the first time there was going to be affirmative action, and at City Hall would be a place where black folks would be welcome.
Well, you've been an insider with every Atlanta mayor since Maynard in 1974. If you will, give us a thumbnail sketch of each of them and what you think they accomplished?
Well, I think Maynard, obviously, as the first black mayor of Atlanta, was the person that really set in motion a mechanism and a machinery to help other blacks get elected, and also to, in many ways, show that a black could be mayor. He had a tumultuous relationship with the business community, but he was proven correct when he said he was going to build a new airport under budget and on time. So his successes were in the economic development area and in jobs in Atlanta, and in many ways, making folks who had felt left out and left behind in government feel a part of government. Then Andy Young came in after Maynard had really plowed a whole new area of political change here. And Andy really came to a position where he put Atlanta on the map internationally. Delta started to fly more internationally during that time. Andy had a good relationship with the, Maynard did not have a really great relationship with the media. But Andy did. I think when Andy came in, one of the first things he ever said was, you know, you can fight with the media, you can fight with the Constitution and the Journal, he said you're not going to get anywhere. They buy ink by the barrel. And that was his philosophy. So Andy kind of got along with everybody. And Shirley Franklin, who is now the current day mayor, really in many ways ran the city under Andy. She was in charge of things here, and Andy traveled quite a bit. But if it hadn't been for Andy Young, in 1996, we would not have had an Olympic game. So the Olympics really, in terms of legacy and putting Atlanta into the international mode, was Andy's legacy. Mm-hmm. Now, after Andy was elected 2 terms, Maynard came back. And I think Maynard wishes now, I think people wish now that Maynard didn't come back, because he really didn't move in that second, we call it Maynard 1, Maynard 2, that second term in each side. He wasn't going to run again, but he anointed a young city council member who was his floor leader, William Craig Campbell. And Bill decided that he was going to have different kinds of legacies. Unfortunately, one of his legacies, he went to jail. But I think that people would say now in Atlanta is that Atlantic Station wouldn't be here today hadn't been built for Bill Campbell. You wouldn't have had a lot of the development in downtown. He set in motion the kinds of things that now have brought 100,000 new people into Atlanta in the last 9 years. He also hired a woman named Renee Glover to head up the Atlanta Housing Authority, which has become a model in the country in terms of bringing together mixed income groups and tearing down the housing projects that used to be a place of last resort to becoming a place where recidivism and crime was breeding. And then Shirley Franklin came in after Bill Campbell, and for 8 years now, Shirley's been mayor. She says that she's not worried about her legacy, so I guess I shouldn't be. But I think that if you want to take a look at Shirley's legacy, she has been the brick-by-brick mayor. She has been the SOAR mayor. She has been the person that has helped put the infrastructure back into place. But she's also been the mayor in many ways, okay, that has found in the last 2 or 3 years crime, whether it's for real or not, becoming more violent in the city, and unfortunately for her, the economic crisis in the country has brought about police furloughs and a lot of firing of city employees. I think Shirley will probably come away looking pretty good after 8 years. You got to mention that one more time that you're in the historic Manuel's Tavern,
okay.
A place that Zell Miller, Jimmy Carter, great Georgia politicians, Republicans and Democrats. Sonny Perdue comes for lunch here, okay, and that really, this is an institution.
It is a very historical place. Manuel was a very historical person.
He was.
Well, why don't you tell us about Manuel Malou?
I will. I should move this glass from. Well, there we go. That's okay. Eddie Maloof, he grew up in Atlanta. He grew up in a section of Atlanta right now, not too far from Turner Field, in a neighborhood that was the ethnic part of Atlanta, where the Lebanese and Jews and Greeks lived next door to each other in Atlanta. And back in 1956, he opened up a 12 to 15 stool bar. It just sold beer, and which was a dry cleaning store prior to that, and called it Manual's. And he always had a love for politics, and being a Lebanese, had a desire to make it over here in the new country. And he became very early on involved in the political situation in Atlanta. I didn't meet him until 1967. People told me that this guy voluntarily integrated the bars in Atlanta before other bars were integrated here, and that this was a place that the political figures in Atlanta came to. And so in 1967, when I met him, he was a as I put that on the other side over there. Manuel had already well established himself here, as the Carl Sanders would come through here, Jimmy Carter would come through here, Bob Short would come through here. In those days he just still served beer, but he became a rational political force in Atlanta. People would come to Manuel's, particularly journalists. And so this became the media hangout. So this became the media and the political hangout. So you'd have all of the folks that, took their notepads and they would come here. Paul Hemphill was a well-known columnist here in Atlanta, came here. And so Manuel's became the place to be in the late 60s, and has held on to a position for more than 40 years as, if you're going to get elected in Atlanta, you got to come through Manuel's and either have a party here, shake hands here, or be seen here. In the old days, drinking beer, but in these days, I guess he would have a nice tea. And Manuel went on to become an elected official himself. He became chairman of the DeKalb County Commission, and was always perceived as being a very frugal man. I don't think anybody ever got a free beer off him here. Somebody that was always willing to, in his own way, give his opinion, and you may have disagreed with his opinion, and oftentimes if you disagreed with his position, you say, get the hell out of here. But by and large, he was a man bigger than life, and his name will live on. Not more than just in DeKalb County, but as a political institution in the city.
You mentioned that you campaigned for Zell Miller in 1974 for lieutenant governor. In 1990, when he ran for governor, one of his opponents was Andrew Young. Who are you for?
That's a very interesting thing. Jimmy Carter probably wouldn't be elected today had Andy Young and Zell Miller not run against each other. And I was on the radio, luckily, in those days, and I did one of the debates, actually, in 1990 between Andy and Zell. I think it was on Channel 5 here. I had encouraged Andy to run, not thinking Zell was going to run. And when they both ran against each other, I was unfortunately in a position of being on the radio. But I guess you would have to say that I supported Andy. But I would put it to you this way. It was a civil campaign, and it was a good campaign. Miller had two interesting people running his campaign that went on to great fame, James Carville and Paul Begala. Miller had them on his side. Andy had on his side George Stephanopoulos, Frank Greer, Mandy Grunwald went on to the White House, and the chief of staff now in the United States, for the United States president for Obama, Rabbi Rahm Emanuel. Rahm Emanuel used to go to Andy every day and get him to make phone calls to raise funds. Rahm became the fundraiser. Well, all of these folks that ran Miller's campaign and ran Young's campaign came together to elect Jimmy Carter president in 1992. So if it hadn't been for an Andy Young and I think it was Andy Young it was Zell Miller who introduced Carville to Bill Clinton.
Yes.
And I can remember the day after Miller was elected, that day he invited us all to come by, and Carville explained how the whole thing unraveled and said what a gentleman Andrew Young had been in his graceful endorsement of Miller and campaigning for Miller for the election in 1990 after he had lost.
Two of your good friends are good friends of mine, John Lewis and Julian Bond. You were very close to both of them. Tell us a little about each.
Well, Mr. Lewis is an old and dear friend who I actually met in Cambridge, Maryland, when I was 15 years old. And he was chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He's a very serious man. He's a man of great integrity. He's a man that believes firmly that the American dream still must live on, that you must keep your eyes on the prize, and that he is become an icon. Time magazine one time called him a living saint. Well, Mr. Lewis isn't quite a living saint as much as a friend as he is to the nation, but he's a man of integrity. He's a man of great honesty and compassion. He truly believes in a beloved community at peace with itself. And he has taken that throughout his entire life. Probably there wasn't any major figure in the civil rights movement that hadn't been had been as many times to jail or beaten as John Lewis. Julian Bond, on the other hand, well, besides having James as his brother, he's a pretty decent guy. Jane is wonderful, is Jane Moore, and wonderful family. His father, a great academic man, and his mother, a wonderful literary person and a sweetheart. But Julian, everybody in Atlanta thought after Julian was elected in a kind of disputed election in 1966 that they thought Julian Bond would be the congressman from Atlanta, the first black congressman from Atlanta. Well, as we know, it became Andrew Young. But when Andrew Young became ambassador to the UN, and it wound up being an election between John Lewis and Julian Bond, which luckily again, I was doing talk radio, so I had to keep a fairly neutral position in that whole thing, although Lillian Lewis and John Lewis didn't think so. I wound up not actually talking with John for about a year after the election, and Lillian maybe longer. I think Julian was in many ways he'd be the intellectual side of the political equation. He would have been a great congressman. There's no question about it. John is too, but I think Julian would have been a great congressman. As chance has it, he went on to Washington. He ran, as you well know, he ran for president and lost in the primaries, but he ran. He was nominated for vice president, and was too young in Chicago in 1968. He is a person of words. He's a wordsmith, whereas John is a man of emotion. Julian's a wordsmith man, and he went on. After his life in Georgia, he went on to become chairman of the NAACP, a position he still holds.
Mm-hmm. Let's get back for just a minute to the civil rights movement. After the death of Dr. King and the passage of several Supreme Court decisions against segregation and the passage of the Civil Rights and Voting Act, has the movement been pronounced dead?
No. And I want to go back to something quickly here in terms of talking about the South. You asked earlier a question about how Dr. King or others perceived white politicians in the South, and who I mentioned Ivan Allen and Charlie Weltner as an example of where the white. If it hadn't been for white male judges in the South between 1955 and 1968, the movement would have been dead at its heels. I mean, basically, it was a lot from the Tuttles and the Edenfields to the white judges of the South in that period of time from the 50s through the 90s were real heroes in this country. And many of them appointed, by the way, by Eisenhower, which was a Republican president. But going back to what you were saying about what was that question again? It was you were asking
whether or not the movement
is dead. Well, the movement is I mean, obviously. I mean, there's no, you're not going to, as much as people want to get people marching again, getting people out in the streets again, the teabaggers have it these days. I mean, it's a movement, that continues to exist. The dream lives on and will never die. It just did different tactics and different times. Marches were right. Marches were absolutely correct in the 50s and 60s in this country. They brought about the change. Nonviolence was right as a tactic in those days. It brought about the change. Today, there's different kinds of techniques and tactics. I mean, it's not, you're not organizing like labor had to do in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. And the picket line is not the same thing today as it was many years ago. So a civil rights movement per se, a new generation is coming along, and in many ways that new generation is going to lead us into a different kind of movement than we have today. The election last year of Barack Obama, in many ways, is that new direction. And unfortunately in the South, only 10 to 15% of whites voted for Obama. But around the rest of the country, and the overall vote was very encouraging, because you had more than 40% of whites in America to vote for a black man for president, one with the name of Barack Hussein Obama. So, I mean, there are many differences that are taking place in terms of the movement of the country. We have a hell of a lot of work to do in the South, though, Bob. And I don't think it's a movement that can be brought about by mass demonstrations or boycotts or those kinds of things anymore. It has to take place in a change of heart. And that change of heart is still very difficult to come by in terms of many white politicians. And as I said earlier, those courageous Democrats in this country in the 60s and early 70s, many of them have died, have grayed, have frayed, or moved on. And I want to see a new breed of those folks that can come out there and can give leadership.
Do you think there's anybody out there who could fill Dr. King's shoes?
By the way, I want to say this too. 2 white Southerners are the only 2 Democrats we had as presidents before we had a black African-American president.
Okay, now, can you answer my question? Can you see anyone out there who could fill Dr. King's shoes?
I'm sure there will be someday, but probably not in my lifetime. I think Barack Obama to many today is what King was to many people of his era, particularly young blacks and young whites as well. Which I think the young whites and young blacks across the country see the hope and the dream in Barack Obama that they saw in the days of Martin Luther King. Was my excitement level as high on Barack Obama being elected president of the United States as it was working for Dr. King and driving him around, listening to his speeches and his sermons? No, it wasn't. But I'm saying that today there are many, many people around this country and around the world that take new hope and inspiration in Barack Obama. So, I mean, but there's a different kind of leadership. It's a different kind of time. It's a different kind of movement than it was back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Will we have another Herman Talmadge in Georgia? I don't think so. I don't think that Johnny Isaacson or what's his name, Chambliss, can possibly, tie the shoes of a Herman Talmadge. Herman Talmadge may have been a racist and segregationist, but he was the father of the food stamps. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was little things like that these Southern politicians did in their own ways, in their own days.
Let's talk a minute about the assassination of Dr. King and his funeral in Atlanta. Where were you when that happened?
I was actually in Knoxville, Tennessee. I had been in Memphis on April 1st, and Dr. King had then announced that he was going back to Atlanta and then coming back to Memphis to speak and to lead this rally and demonstration. And my job was in the Poor People's Campaign, which we were organizing. Memphis was in the middle of, and it was really a diversion in the Poor People's Campaign. We weren't scheduled to go to Memphis. The sanitation workers went on strike, so we broke out there. Labor, which was very much a part of the civil rights movement and very much a part of Resurrection City and the March on Washington, the Poor People's March on Washington, really pushed Dr. King to go to Memphis against the wishes of many people, including Andy Young. But what happened was, I was in Knoxville, Tennessee, with a guy named Ernie Austin, who was from Kentucky. And what we did was, we were organizing, we were speaking to the Tennessee Council on Human Relations, actually the night of the 4th, to try to get them to get poor white folks involved in the Poor People's Campaign. My job was what we were trying to do was bring together Hispanics, bring together Native Americans, bring together poor white folks, all to march together in Washington with black folks. The first real Rainbow Coalition. So my job was up there was to talk to the folks, and I was going to the meeting at 6 o'clock in Knoxville. I can remember it to this day, and I heard a kid yell out in the street, "Martin Luther King's been shot! Martin Luther King's been shot!" I said, I hope that this kid's, is not, he's gonna cause some trouble here in the streets saying that kind of stuff. And I get to the church and find out that indeed Dr. King had been shot, and I had called the house, and I got Miss Lockhart, who was the housekeeper, on the telephone, and she told me that Coretta was getting ready to go to the airport, that Mayor Ivan Allen was coming to the house and picking her up and taking her to the airport. And she said, do you think I should come back? And she said, yes. Well, I made several other calls, and then Ernie and Austin and I came back to Atlanta. We found out shortly after that Dr. King had passed, and for the next 48 hours, essentially, I didn't get any sleep at all. Came back and helped organize the transportation for the funeral. Mm-hmm. But the mood in Atlanta was very interesting. While there were riots all over the country, Atlanta was relatively calm, and it was an eerie calm. As you recall, the day of the funeral, probably one of the biggest overreactions that Lester Maddox ever had in his political career was ringing the state capitol with state troopers, which was certainly not necessary. It was a overkill. The city of Atlanta remained peaceful for those 6 days between Dr. King's assassination and that funeral. And the mood of this town, black and white, Southerners and non-Southerners, and people that flocked here, was to be as helpful as they possibly could be in giving the send-off for King.
Mm-hmm. Well, after your civil rights days, you became a talking head on the radio.
Yeah.
How did you ever come to that decision?
Naturally, I was vaccinated with, a microphone. Really, I think what happened was, the first time I really became interested in doing talk, I used to, as a kid, I'd pretend I was doing the Tonight Show under my blankets and doing it, as an 8, 9-year-old kid. I always wanted to get in radio. I always wanted to be part of radio. And I started writing a column for Atlanta Magazine and for the Atlanta Gazette called The Tatler. And The Tatler sort of was a political column and is also kind of like a gossip column. And this is back in 1976, 77. And I was at a basketball game, a Hawks basketball game. A guy named Mike Wheeler, who went on to be one of the founders of HBO, was head of GST at the time, WGST Radio. And he asked me if I would put that Tatler on the radio every morning. And, I said, I'd love to do it. So he asked me to come on. So I started doing commentaries for GST, 77. and that led to a talk show. Part of it hosted by me, and another part of it hosted by me and Dick Williams, who's a well-known star, and another part of it brought Neil Bortz back into the business, and he was my counterpoint for about 3 or 4 months. It was either he was going to kill me or I was going to kill him. But Bortz was part of the show. I actually brought him back to radio. If he sees his interview, Bortz needs to give me part of his salary for life. But at any rate, that's how I got into it. And then it evolved really big time in 1981 when Maynard Jackson was mayor. There was the missing and murdered children of Atlanta, a terrible tragedy here where weeks and weeks went by and there was many children that were killed. And I did a nightly show, which was sort of like before Nightline. And that's when I got really into talk radio big time. Everybody in town had to listen to this. As a matter of fact, I think Wayne Williams, who was the accused killer and the convicted killer of a couple of these kids, his parents were slapped with an injunction for calling my radio show. So I became big time during that period.
And then you were on television.
Well, about that same time, over at Channel 2, Andy Fisher, who was the then news director at Channel 2, WSB TV, thought he'd put together a little talking head show on Sunday called Sunday News Conference. So he put together me, Dick Williams, a fellow named Bill Shipp, and Rick Allen. And we were hosted at that point by a preacher, Ron Saylor. He was a black commentator over there. We continued over there at Channel 2 for several years until a conflict arose between a opinionated news political reporter, Bill Nigut, and Ron Saylor. And that's when we moved our show to Channel 36. But it became kind of like the Sunday morning thing to do, would be like to listen to Tom Houck and Dick Williams go at each other, and Bill Shipp try to sort of moderate it, and Rick Allen being sort of the more moderate person over there. But we had great fun doing it. I did it for 20 years.
20 years.
Left in 2001.
Mm-hmm. You aren't doing any of that anymore.
Every once in a while. I'll do something on CNN, I'll do something on MSNBC or something, but not on a regular basis. I'm writing my book.
Tell us about your book.
Book is a lot of what we talked about right here, and I hope that it will be out within the next couple of years. I ran into Doug Blackman the other day, who's the Wall Street Journal bureau chief here, and he's written a Pulitzer Prize winning book called Slavery by Another Name. So I said, Doug, how long did it take you to write your book? He said, 7 years. I said, well, I've got 3 more years to go, maybe. But I hope to have it out in the next couple of years. And it basically travels that memoir route, how that little, scrappy kid from Boston wound up in the household of the kings, and what all happened and occurred during that time, with great insights that I don't think other people have ever written about regarding the King family and the civil rights movement.
Yeah. Well, I'm anxious to read it. You've always been a loyal Democrat. What has happened to the Democratic Party in Georgia?
Well, I could say 2 words, Bobby Kahn, but I won't. I gotta stop. Don't use that. That's terrible. Well, I think a lot of things has happened. I think that the parties had its problem with the National Party. I think that leaders like Zell Miller have gone from being liberal to moderate to conservative, and that's happened with a number of other people in the state. Miller, I guess, right now has made full circle. He started off as a conservative, then he went to a liberal, then he went to a moderate, and then he went back down to a conservative. So he's made a complete switch. So, a lot of those guys out there, like Miller, have become Republicans. And the General Assembly and the governor's office. Well, the governor's office for the first time went, as you well know, 7 years ago to a Republican. There was not a Tom Murphy that can bring together the various forces. And he actually gerrymandered himself out of being reelected many years ago. I mean, that was the kind of guy he was. But Murphy was able to bring the rural and urban folks together. And the Democratic Party in the state of Georgia, even after the civil rights bills, was more of a club than a philosophy. And so as a club, they could organize under the name Democrat, but it didn't have to keep one specific philosophy. So they didn't have to be in the national party. So we continued to elect Democrats to president, Democrats to the Senate. And then I think probably it really came down when the national movements in this country on abortion and a lot of the far right-wing causes finally crept in. And those people that called themselves Democrats really aligned themselves closer to the Republican National Party. And that's how we lost a lot of that, I think. But I blame Bobby Kahn for losing that election to I think Roy Barnes could have beat Sonny Perdue 8 years ago had Bobby Kahn not been the campaign manager. I don't mind saying that either, by the way. And I think if Bobby Kahn is in the race this year, okay, with Roy Barnes, I think Roy might go down to defeat again. I think this guy's a loser.
Well, if you had the power, Tom, how would you fix these problems?
Make sure Bobby Kahn doesn't get involved. No, I mean, how would I fix these problems? I would fix these problems in many ways. I would campaign like Roy Barnes is beginning to campaign. I would try to bring together around common purpose and common goals some of the things that Barnes is talking about in terms of education, in terms of dealing with resources and water, in terms of dealing with the non-controversial big issues that affect us on an everyday basis, the economy, jobs, those kinds of things, education. I think that that's one of the first things you have to do. Then I think that what you have to take a look at is that race is still a factor. And it divides too many people in the state. But the state is changing. I mean, it's changing dramatically. The Hispanic that lives in Gwinnett County, or lives in Cherokee County, or lives in Spalding County, or Paulding County, or lives down up in Hall County, or lives up in Dalton, Georgia, those folks aren't voting, but their kids will. And when that happens within 10 years, we can begin to see a new dynamic in this state, a larger Hispanic vote coming together with the black vote and the progressive white vote, which I think is the future of the Democratic Party in this state. I think there will be sufficient numbers then to be able to turn back the red tide in Georgia. So I think that we may not be able to turn it around in the next 4 or 8 years, but I think that there's going to be a new coalition of Democrats here within the near future that's going to substantially change I think we'll see more Democrats elected after this next census than we have right now. I think the Democratic Party it needs a vibrant leader at the top, not the Blast Jane kid who I like and respect very much from Athens. I mean, she's a good lady, but we don't have the dynamism. We don't have we don't have the force out there of somebody that can really bring people together. And we lost 8 years of organization, because when Bobby Kahn was executive director of the Democratic Party of Georgia, what he did was not organize those House districts and those House seats out there. All he did was try to organize against Sonny Perdue. So we lost House seats, we lost Senate seats. We didn't have any organization out there, and we had no funds out there. So you have to get the funding together, and you need to get the organization together, and I think we need to come up with a dynamic leader. If Roy Barnes is elected governor next year, I think the Democratic Party will be well on its way to getting its house back in order.
It's been said that the Republicans defeat the Democrats in Georgia because they have what they call a better bench, which means that they train their candidates. They carefully select their candidates.
Well, you think John Linder's a good bench?
I can't pass judgment.
Do you think that Dr. Price is a good bench?
I can't.
Do you think Phil Dingery is a good bench?
You know, I'm like you in that Miller Young race and that Bond John Lewis race. I I'm what Marvin Griffin would call a twinsy.
I don't think they've got a good bench. I think that's what they have. Okay, what they've been having is they've with Ralph Reed and other. Ralph Reed lost his election here. That philosophy, okay, that was originated back in under Richard Nixon back over there from our old friend Lee Atwater in South Carolina, has really ruled the South for the last 40 years. And I think that what Lyndon Johnson said to Richard Russell was correct. That after he came out and voted for the Voting Rights Act and voted for the Civil Rights Bill of 64 and 65, he told Richard Russell, we've lost the next 50 years of Democrats. Yeah. But that 50 years is almost up.
That's right. That's right. Well, Tom, you're certainly an interesting gentleman. I've enjoyed talking with you, but is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would like to talk about?
No, I think that James is hungry, and Harold over there is looks like he could need something. Not really. I would like to say that I hope that whatever happens in the election in Atlanta this year, okay, that this city continue to grow and prosper, and I think it will. I think that the talk of having a white woman elected mayor of Atlanta is a possibility. I don't put that aside. I think that we've come a long way, though, from 1973 to 2009. And if there is a white mayor this time, okay, in Atlanta, which would turn the clock of history either back or forward, depending on what your viewpoint would be, I think that it would not be the end all of the progressive aspects of the city. And I think that even if Elisa Borders or a Kasim Reed gets elected, that it's time for the changing of the guard at City Hall, so to speak. And I think that no matter who's elected, that's what you have to look at. You have to look at a new Atlanta. 100,000 folks have moved here in the last 5 years. It's a lot of people coming to this town. And Atlanta has a lot of new young blood. We need to tap into that.
Thank you, Tom Houck.